Welcome everyone to Pathways Through the Orchard. This week is Parshat Metzorah, and this parsha many times goes along with the previous parsha of Tazria. In a non-leap year, many times they're read together. And Tazria, which we discussed last week, has to do with the skin disease called tzara'at. And in this week's parsha, at least the beginning, is how does the person who has this skin ailment, how is he purified? And part of his purification was that he was sent outside of the camp for 7 days, sometimes a second 7 days. And now, as preparation for the completion of the tshuva process, he goes through this very, very symbolic ritual. And then the rest of the portion is about various different ideas connected to purity and impurity, states of being in a state of purity and states of being in impurity, and how one becomes purified. And that we'll discuss later as well. So in the parsha, this skin ailment is called a nega. We'll call it, the specific name is tzara'at, which comes from the word tzara, which means trouble, problem, pain, suffering, tzara. We discussed this last week, the root of tzara. And the general name for a plague is called a nega. So in this parsha, many times they go together, the nega of tzara'at. And actually, Rav Ginsburg points out that this root, nega, nun gimel ayin, appears 61 times in these two portions, last week's portion of Tazria and this week's portion of Metzorah. 61 times the root of nega appears. Again, it means a plague. So there's a statement in Sefer Yetzirah. Sefer Yetzirah is probably the oldest of all Kabbalistic texts. It's a short, relatively short text, but highly influential. And there's a statement that says, Ein betova lemala mi'oneg, ve'ein bera'a lemata min nega. Translated, that means, in goodness, there's nothing higher than oneg. Oneg means pleasure. Oneg Shabbos, the pleasure of Shabbos. So there's nothing in the category of good higher or more qualitative than oneg. And in the realms of negativity, of evil, there's nothing lower than nega. That's our word here for plague, nega. That again appears 61 times. Now, what's the connection here? Is that the letters of oneg are the same letters of nega, but permuted differently. Not opposite, but permuted differently. Oneg, nega, same letters. So the Sefer Yetzirah says there's nothing above oneg and nothing below nega. And even though it doesn't point it out, this is one of the most ancient context for the whole idea of permuting letters of a word. It doesn't announce it. Now we're going to permute the letters of nega, and we see that it's oneg. It just does it. But since the Sefer Yetzirah is such an ancient book of Kabbalah, it sets a precedent for the very, very important process of permuting letters to find the deeper meanings in a root. And this has tremendous consequences and influence on our being able to get to the inner dimensions of the Torah. By understanding that within a 3-letter root, or once you go beyond the 3 letters and you start permuting the letters, you start getting the full picture, the full spectrum. In Hebrew, it's called a partsuf, the full stature of the power of the letters that make up this root. So one of the places, excuse me, in Isaiah 58:14, where the word oneg is used, and this is, in a sense, the root of the concept of oneg Shabbat, comes from a verse that says, Az titaneg al Hashem. It's talking about Shabbat. Yeshayahu is talking about Shabbat. In fact, many people take the verses a little before what I just quoted and a little after, and say it before saying Kiddush on Shabbat day. Az titaneg al Hashem. Then you will have pleasure with Hashem, in Hashem. And this is the oneg of Shabbat, the pleasure of Shabbat. And the Ramchal, so in his writings, so he said in the introduction, he says the whole purpose of God creating mankind is to fulfill this verse. Now, God wanted to do good. What's the greatest good is to be connected to the source of goodness. God is the source of goodness. And so the Ramchal said, Az titaneg al Hashem, this is the ultimate and the very purpose of human beings being created, and becomes the purpose and the main life force of how we serve Hashem, how we do mitzvot, what our worldview is. So here I'm just pointing out that the source of this idea of permuting the letters to see the connections is from the Sefer Yetzirah. But here we see total opposites. Nega, there's nothing lower than nega, nothing higher than oneg. And so this is a very, very interesting thing about Hebrew roots, that many times when you permute, you'll get many different words. You can get a 2-letter word, you can get a 3-letter word. If it's a longer word, like Bereshit. Bereshit, Tikunei Zohar, is 70 chapters on the permutations of the word Bereshit, in the beginning. Bereshit has 6 letters. So if you permuted all the letters in the different ways that you could, there's 720 different ways that you can permute these 6 letters. And Tikunei Zohar does many of them. Doesn't do all 720, but it does most of the main ones that actually tell us what we'll call the who, what, where, and why of creation. It's all in the word Bereshit, and it's all through the permutations. So for those who were here last week, this is just a quick review. For those who aren't, I'm introducing this. Is in last week's Parsha, we had a very, very similar idea with permuting letters. And that is that the beginning of last week's Parsha began with, it's called Tazria. And it's when a woman conceives, or literally gives seed. Tazria comes from the word zera. Zera means seed. And then it goes in, the whole rest of the Parsha is about this disease, a skin ailment called tzara'at. And that root is tzara. as we mentioned before, Tzadi Resh Ayin. And because Zayin and Tzadi come from the same place in the mouth, there's 5 different places in the mouth that creates the sounds of letters. And when letters come from the same place in the mouth, they can be exchanged. And so Zera and Sarah are the Zayin and the Tzadi can be exchanged. And then the second 2 letters are the same, Ra, which means evil. But here, again, we're going to have opposites because Zera, seed, represents sexuality. And we know that when used in a proper way at the proper time between the proper people, then within the marital union, marital intimacy becomes really, even though it's the most physical of acts, it becomes the most spiritual of acts. But we also know when sexuality becomes just based on pure lust and desire and pure physicality, it can drive people down to the worst of the worst. And it's in the same word. And we saw that the second 2 letters of Zera is Ra, evil. But if you take those 2 letters and you switch them, is Er, to be awake. Again, we went over all of this last week, but it fits in here because we're talking about permuting the letters. So we saw that Zera and Sarah, with permuting letters, is very connected. And Ra and Er. In other words, sexuality can awaken the highest spiritual intentions and have the most pleasure. And at the same time, when it's just used in a cavalier way with no real emotional or love connection, then it could be pleasurable, but in most cases, it leads to heartbreak. In most cases. So now let's go back to this idea that the word nega and the root of nega appears 61 times. So this we heard from Rav Ginsburg, but he explains that 61 equals ani, the word for I. This word represents ego. Now again, ego can be used in a proper way, and it can be the source of pride and arrogance and lusting after power. And here, the connection is, why would a person get this skin disease? We're told that it was not because of physical reasons. It wasn't a biological disease. It was caused as a measure for thought, speech, or action, mostly in this case, speech, because we're told there's a whole list of different possible wrongdoings that a person could do that would bring this skin ailment upon them. But the one that stands out is what's called lashon hara, is evil speech. And here again we have the word ra here, lashon hara, evil speech. And therefore, what causes a person to speak badly about someone else, or rumor monger, or spread lies, is a person feels their worldview is so egocentric, they feel they have the right to say whatever they want about whomever they want, to whomever they want. And it could be true or not true. It could be for the reasons of ruining a person's reputation, of spreading rumors about a person. And it's coming from from the view of just extreme egotism. And so that's what Rav Ginsburg explains, is that the 61 times that nega is mentioned is connected to this idea of ani. So what is the healing? What is the rectification? And so if, again, we're really centering here on permutations. So if you permute the letters of the word ani, I, and you make it, instead of aleph nun yud, you make it aleph yud nun. Right, you just switch the yud and the nun. It spells ein, ayin, nothingness. And so we see in the Torah that the rectification for this person is to humble themselves. And that's why they're sent outside of the camp and they're alone. They have to dwell for 7 days alone in order to balance that overcharged ego and to come to a place of humbleness. So in this week's Parsha, the ritual in which the person with tzara'at, he's called the Metzorah, again from the root tzara, he is cleansed in the following way. I'll just do it very quickly, that he's outside the camp. The Kohen goes out and sees if he's ready to, if the skin ailment is subsiding and he's ready to be purified. And then the person brings, the Kohen helps him, bring a branch of an erez tree, of a cedar tree, a string, a red string that was dyed in the color of a certain worm that makes a red color, and hyssop, a zov. And Rashi explains why these three things, that the cedar tree in the Middle East is the tallest of all the trees. It's the most majestic, the cedars of Lebanon. It's even on their flag to this day, the cedars of Lebanon. It's the equivalent of, let's say, the redwoods in California. And since it was the highest tree, the person has to realize that's how they got into this whole trouble in the first place, is because they saw themselves as higher than everyone else. The color of the worm on the string, obviously the worm is considered a very lowly animal. And the azov, the hyssop, it's a kind of herb that grows, it hugs the ground. It doesn't have any height to it. It just spreads along the ground. And so this is also the idea of humbling oneself. It's called shiflut, the state of existential lowliness. And the person brings all of this, and then the two birds are brought. And one is slaughtered, and the blood is caught in a clay jar that has living waters in it. And the second bird is, and then the person is sprinkled 7 times, very similar to Yom Kippur, that the Kohen Gadol at the time of the temple did a whole series of sprinkling blood from the altar as an atonement. And it happens here with the Metzorah also. And many, many people comment that these 2 birds that are taken are reminiscent of the 2 goats that are taken on Yom Kippur. Again, at the time of the temple, we don't do this now, but at the time of the temple, 2 goats were taken, and one was slaughtered, and the other one was sent into the desert. And here the second bird is set free. And then the person has to go through another 7 days, but this time he's back in the camp. And then there's a final healing on the 8th day. And so I bring all of this because the idea is this idea of humbling, of taking the ani, and after a whole week of being isolated by oneself in order to go through a tshuva process, then goes through this very, very symbolic and powerful ritual, especially letting this bird go, represents the freedom that the person must feel after having gone through this whole process and now is ready to have learned the lessons and to come back into the camp. There's another meaning for this root of nega. And the other meaning is, in Hebrew, is to be negia b'devar. Negia b'devar means involved in a subject, part of the picture, has an interest in. And so that's why it's usually used that, let's say you're trying to come up with an objective opinion. And so the expression, let's say someone suggests, why don't we use this person? And someone will say, well, he's negia b'devar. In other words, he is somehow involved in the circumstances of the case that we're trying to look at. And so he's not a proper person to give an objective opinion because he's negia b'devar. He's touching the matter. That's why even in modern law, that if a judge, let's say, knows the plaintiff or the defender or the person on trial, he needs to excuse himself because he can't give an objective opinion. He knows his person. He might have very close relations with him, or the opposite. He might really dislike this person, but the point is the judge is supposed to be impartial and give a objective judgment. So all of that is coming from the same word of nega, but there's we'll call it almost the opposite meaning, and that's when something is negia belev. It touches the heart. I should have said this, that negia means also involved in a manner, but it means touching, simply physical touching. And so here, there's positive types of touch, and there's negative types of touch. I don't think I have to delve into this. I think everyone can use their imagination, that there's ways that we use touch which are not appropriate, and there's ways that we use touch which are very loving and endearing and positive. So here we see with the same root, it can take on a very negative manifestation or very, very positive. So here the expression is negia belev. It touches the heart. In English, the idea of that really touches me, or someone makes a touching statement, means that it's heartfelt, it's emotional, it hits the strings of the heart. So here we want to introduce, at least at first it will sound somewhat paradoxical, is in the book of Isaiah, 53rd chapter, the 4th verse. This chapter in Isaiah is an extremely important chapter for a bit of an ironic reason. This passage, it's many, many verses, and it's not the only time it appears, but this is the most famous. It actually appears 3 or 4 other times, this similar types of descriptions, where here it's talking about a future redeemer, Mashiach, and he's described as being afflicted with a nega, and that he is mukeh. He's it's another word for afflicted, and this is commonly known as a passage called the suffering servant. And it goes on about this future redeemer who we might imagine will be this glorious figure to lead us to the whole world to freedom and a new level of consciousness. But here he's described as bearing the sins of the people, bearing the burdens of the people, carrying the whole world on his shoulders, and that he will be stricken, he will be afflicted. Now, the reason it became so famous is because Christianity took this passage and say that this applies to Yeshu. This is a description, this is a prophecy about Yeshu. But in our tradition, like I said, this idea of a suffering servant appears a number of times in Yeshayahu, and every time it's clear it's talking about the whole people in a metaphor as a person. And so the Christianity took this out of its context and apply it to who they call their Redeemer. And so it became very, very famous because it's quoted all over the place. And it's taken on the name, the suffering servant. But I'm bringing all of this because this Redeemer is described as having a nega, of having tzara'at, having the skin ailment. Later, the sages in a discussion about Mashiach, this is in Sanhedrin, they discuss, again, very, very symbolic, many, many different levels of understanding, but they ask, where will we find Mashiach? Where is he like hanging out, as it were? And they answer a very startling answer. They say, he is a Metzorah. He has this skin ailment, and he's sitting in the gates of Rome. And so one of the sages say, well, there are probably a lot of people there that are in the same situation. How do we identify the Mashiach? And so they answer, again, very symbolic language. They say, all the others, they have bandages over their skin, over their limbs, but they have to change them because they have to keep it clean. So they take off all of the bandages at once, and then they roll them around the arm, around the legs again. And they say Mashiach is different because he only takes off one wrap at a time, because he might be called upon at any minute to reveal himself. Now, again, this is very, very typical, what's called Agadata, the midrash, of discussing very deep matters in metaphorical, allegorical, parable types of ways. But here it's so significant that Mashiach has tzara'at. So one of the ways we can understand this is going back to the idea of negia belev, touched to the heart. Because in the passage called the suffering servant, and again, in Judaism, it applies to the Jewish people, not just an individual. It applies to the Jewish people, as we're going to see in a second. And the Jewish people and the Mashiach are carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. Sometimes the Jewish people are described as being the conscience of the world. You wouldn't know it now if you read the newspapers, that's for sure. That is for sure. But it has been said many, many times, and considering the moral and ethical contributions that Judaism has made to the world, that is a pretty accurate kind of statement. So here, the idea of Mashiach being afflicted with a nega is because he's the pain of the world, the brokenness of the world. It gets to the core of his being, and that's why he's able to be Mashiach. That's why he's able to be God's messenger to rectify the world, is because the pain of the world touches him so deeply. It's a very, very deep idea here. And so this part I'm saying now is actually in the Orchard of Delights on this parsha, but it fits in here perfectly, is the Or HaChaim. The Or HaChaim was a very, very famous commentator from Morocco. He made Aliyah to Israel in the around 1740. The Baal Shem Tov, part of his purpose, a great part of his purpose of trying to come to Israel was to meet with the Or HaChaim. That's how great a figure he was. So he explains this ritual that we discussed before of how a Metzorah becomes purified in the following way. He says that the person who's outside the camp with tzara'at, this is all of Am Yisrael, that because of our misdeeds, the temples were destroyed, we were sent into exile. This is like being outside of the camp of the nations. We were thrust out of Israel. We wandered the world, and we were not in our camp. We were in exile. And so this individual that we're describing in the Torah, the Or HaChaim says this represents all of Israel in exile. And then it says that the Kohen goes out to see if the person is ready to be purified. So the Or HaChaim says that, as it were, this Kohen is God. And God is going out to see, is it time to bring the Jewish people back into the camp, back into Israel? And then he explains that the two birds here, one bird will be slaughtered and the blood will be sprinkled towards the person as an atonement, and the other bird is set free. So the Or HaChaim says an amazing thing, that we have a tradition that there are actually two Messianic figures, Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David. And the difference is, we're told that Mashiach ben Yosef will begin the process of the final redemption, And in many versions, Mashiach ben Yosef will fight the final wars and will die in the process. And so again, this is somewhat symbolic, and there are many, many different understandings of who Mashiach ben Yosef is and what he'll do. But one of them is, it's not necessarily a single person. It could be a whole generation, and it could be a whole century. In other words, a flow of history that is moving towards redemption, that includes many, many, many conflicts and wars. So if we look back just 100 years, World War I, World War II, and then we come to Israel, the War of Independence in 1948, the Sinai War in 56, the Six-Day War in 67, the Yom Kippur War in 73, a whole series of wars in Lebanon, 1981. And then over the last 20 years, every 2 or 3 years, there's a war with Gaza and there's a war with Lebanon. So all of this together can be interpreted as the period leading up to Mashiach ben Yosef. And when we think how many people died in the process, so this can be interpreted as Mashiach ben Yosef dying in the process. And then the Or HaChaim says that the bird that is set free, this represents freedom coming to Israel, freedom coming to the world, and this bird represents Mashiach ben David. And so this is just such an awesome concept and way to look at the Parsha, because again, we read the Parsha and it appears we're dealing with individuals. But here the Or HaChaim reframed it that on a deeper level, this is talking about all of history. This is not talking about a person with a skin ailment. This is symbolic of all of Jewish history. So it's just such a deep idea. And I want to go back to one thing, and we'll wrap up this idea here, is again, we're told that the primary reason of this skin ailment, tzara'at, is coming from lashon hara, of evil speech. But it's brought down, if you take the letters of Mashiach, the way it's written, Mem Shin Yud Chet, and you just change the shin to a sin. In other words, the way that you pronounce it, it's Masiach, which means the speaker, the one who speaks. Because in Hebrew, the word for a conversation is a siach. So the Mashiach here, it's such a beautiful connection, is that the way to heal evil speech is with positive speech, good speech. And this is represented by the Mashiach, who will conquer the world really with his mouth. We're told that Mashiach will fight the last wars. It could be Mashiach ben Yosef, it could be Mashiach ben David, it could be both. It could, like I said, it could be a generation, it could be a century. The whole process, for those who went to our War and Peace in Jewish tradition, we discussed this at length, the different ideas of the final wars before Mashiach comes. But here, we're told that even if Mashiach ben David has to fight the last wars, he will actually conquer the world through the power of speech, the power of revelation, of explaining the purpose of creation, the purpose of the Torah, the purpose of mankind. and will bring everyone together through the power of his teaching. He will be the Messiah. He will be the one with the gift of the mouth. Okay, so now let's move to another insight here. Is in 2 parshas ago, in Parshat Shmini, we mentioned that throughout the Torah, mostly I have to say in the book of Leviticus, the book that we're in now, there is a concept, and especially in this week's parsha, that's why I'm bringing it here, this idea of purity and impurity. It's been brought up before and will be brought up again, but the main place where purity and impurity are mentioned is in last week's parsha and this week's parsha, and especially this week's parsha, because it goes to a whole series of different ways that a person becomes impure and how they become pure. And the way they become pure is by, it just says rachatz b'mayim, bathing in water. It doesn't say immersing in a mikvah. Sometimes vessels have to be immersed. Sometimes clothing has to be immersed, and sometimes the person, the body has to be immersed. But the word that is used most commonly is rachatz b'mayim, bathing, washing in water. And we saw 2 weeks ago that the only place where mikvah, as the place where this cleansing happens, is mentioned only once in Shmini. But in this week's parsha, the whole parsha really, it talks over and over again that if a person, for whatever reason, becomes ritually impure, and I'll mention again, it doesn't mean unclean. Purity and impurity in the Torah are spiritual concepts. It's not cleanliness concepts, even though it's, I grew up, maybe others did also, with the concept cleanliness is close to godliness. Many of us were raised by mothers or parents where cleanliness was a very, very important thing, which it is. Cleanliness and order and beauty in the home and how we present ourselves are very important. But purity and impurity are spiritual concepts, just like this disease, tzara'at, is a spiritual concept. It comes because of spiritual reasons. And so I wanted just to take the opportunity, since this week, more than any other place in the Torah, it talks about bathing in water, and we know that it's in a mikvah. So first of all, an ocean can be a mikvah, a lake can be a mikvah, a spring can be a mikvah, and a stream can be a mikvah. This is all out in nature, and each one has its laws to determine, but in the old days and even today, it's common to immerse oneself in ocean, lake, stream, river. But for us city dwellers, the most common thing is to go to a mikvah, a building that has a ritual bath. And the thing I want to discuss in short is we're told that the minimal amount of water to make a kosher mikvah is what's called 40 seah. A seah is a measurement. I think it comes to something like, don't quote me on this, but I think it's something like 196 gallons. The way it's determined is there's like a very rational reason is for the immersion to be kosher. a person has to immerse their entire body under the water, which means that the space of the mikvah has to be enough water that a person could immerse their whole being, a average size person. And they determined that was 40 sa. So for example, if you go to a stream it's narrow and you lay down in the stream, but you can't get your whole body under the water at one time, it's not a kosher immersion. So the idea of 40 seah becomes very, very symbolic, because we know everything in halacha, everything in Jewish law will have a rational, logical explanation, but will also have a spiritual and many times a mystical explanation. So we know that the number 40 is very, very important in many, many different stories, many different contexts. And we're just going to mention that almost all of them, in fact, all of them, have to do with transition. And that is the actual process of going to a mikvah. Going to a mikvah is a process of transforming oneself, of going through a transformative process, a transition. And so a woman who is finishing her clean days, and it's in this week's parsha, is the main place that we learn about the laws of family purity, which is the absolute foundation of a traditional Jewish marital relationship, are the laws of family purity. We're not going to go into them right now, but there are times of the month where husband and wife can be together intimately. And during menstruation and a 7-day purification afterwards, husband and wife separate and there is no touching. It's very connected to the word nega again. It's not a coincidence that in the same portion, or the same two portions where the word nega is mentioned 61 times, we have this concept in Judaism called negia. Negia simply means that before a man and woman are married, men don't touch women and women don't touch men. And during what are called the clean days, during the menstruation and the clean days, husband and wife don't touch. But it's so connected that in the same parsha where we get the laws of family purity, the root of the idea of touching, which is so important, is in the same parsha of the same root of nega. So very quickly, when a woman goes to the mikvah, she's transitioning from a state where she cannot be with her husband to the state where she can be with her husband. When a person converts according to Jewish law, so men and women have to go to the mikvah because they're transitioning from being a non-Jew to being Jewish. When someone buys or comes into possession of utensils, pots and pans and dishes that were not made by a Jew, they need to be immersed in a mikvah. These they're going from one ownership to another ownership. We know the first time it becomes very significant are the 40 days that it rained, 40 days and 40 nights that it rained at the time of the flood, where the entire world was going through a transition, and many people symbolically say that God, as it were, was immersing the world in a mikvah because it had become so impure, it had become so evil that, as it were, God needed to start again. And so the world was dunked, immersed in a mikvah. And the rain was for 40 days and 40 nights. Of course, we know that Moshe Rabbeinu was on Har Sinai not once for 40 days, but 3 different periods of 40 days. The first 40 days to receive the 10 commandments and the Shnei Luchot HaBrit, the 2 tablets of the law. And then after the golden calf, when Moshe broke the tablets, he went up for another 40 days to beg for forgiveness, plead for forgiveness. And when God accepted it, so then he had to take 2 new tablets and go back up for another 40 days. So there were 3 40-day periods. And this is a transitional period of what we'll call pre-Torah and post-Torah, that the Jewish people, before the Torah was given, it was like one world, but once the Torah is given, it's like another world. And there are other 40s also. Many people interpret that Moshe's life itself was made up of 3 periods of 40. That even though there are different opinions, but one very strong opinion is that Moshe was 40 years old when he left Egypt. He dwelt in Midian for 40 years. We know from the Torah for sure that he was 80 years old at the time of the burning bush when he was commanded to go back to Egypt. We just don't know definitively how old he was when he left Egypt, but one of the opinions was he was 40, and then he died at 120. So Moshe's life itself can be interpreted as going through 3 periods of 40 years. And we're told similarly, Rabbi Akiva. We're told that Rabbi Akiva was only 40 years old when he began to learn Torah. We don't know exactly what happened at 80 years, but he also lived to be 120, like Moshe Rabbeinu. So we see this number 40 is so significant in so many ways, but all of them have to do with transitions and many times transcending, going from one level to another, one state of ownership to another, one status to another. And this is the symbolic amount of water, of the minimal, that one has to have for a kosher mikvah. So this is a good place to stop. And we'll end with a blessing that in a certain way, it's time for God to immerse the world in a mikvah again, but not through destruction, through purifying waters. Like we mentioned Yom Kippur, that the 2 birds of the purification process for the Metzorah are compared and contrasted even with the 2 goats of Yom Kippur. So here, Yom Kippur is about atonement. And just like the Kohen Gadol sprinkles on Yom Kippur, he sprinkled on the Metzorah. And as we learn from the Or HaChaim, the Metzorah, the one with tzara'at, is all of Am Yisrael. And so we need God to cleanse us, purify us, atone for us, protect us, and certainly after the experience of last night, to save us. And many, many miracles last night, many, many miracles that we should acknowledge.